He routinely chased cats, dug holes in their yard, and managed to climb trees when he'd escaped the house after chewing up their furniture. Hello, and welcome to the 11th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at episode 11 of Frasier, entitled Death Becomes Him. It originally aired on December 2nd, 1993, returning to air after taking last Thursday off for Thanksgiving. I'm not sure what was going on with NBC here, but Seinfeld is off this week. It will return next week, while Frasier takes that week off, before both shows air again on December 16th, before again taking several weeks off for Christmas. For the sake of our comparisons, I just plugged in next week's Seinfeld numbers, which line up surprisingly well with this week's Frasier numbers. Death Becomes Him pulled in 25.3 million viewers, a nice jump of 2.1 million from the week before Thanksgiving. Next week, while Frasier is off, Seinfeld will rake in 29.6 million viewers, a climb of 2.2 million from the prior week. Andy Ackerman takes back the director's chair in this episode. On writing duties is the return of Leslie Eberhard. This is his second and final episode of the series. Ackerman also directed Eberhard's other episode. That was episode number 8, Beloved Infidel. The What a Dummy writer is again on a script with a tough topic this week, with unexpected death as the main topic of this episode. I didn't like this episode near as well as Beloved Infidel, but I am still walking away with a positive impression of Eberhard as a writer tackling serious topics. I haven't been able to find a second source to confirm which episode it was, but according to his obituary, Eberhard won a Humanities Award for his writing on one episode of Frasier. Since he only wrote 2, it was either this episode or Beloved Infidel. I was surprised we had a nothing happening intro for this episode. We're still in the right order for production numbers here, so I don't really know what's going on. Maybe this means we'll get a new introduction next episode, or maybe it means we're returning to the red blinking dot. Either way, I have no real guess what our introduction next week will be. The surprise intro isn't the only weird thing with this episode. This is also the first episode of the series where we don't have a guest caller. It looks like this is going to happen a few more times this season, and to tell the truth, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Much like the scene in each Scream film, where the rules are explained, I've gotten used to the guest caller scenes, and was left with a feeling of being slightly unfinished when it didn't happen here. Our episode opens with a Daphne and Niles scene, and holy sexual tension. It's so thick you could cut it with a knife. During this scene, we learn Daphne's never had a serious relationship. According to the IMDb trivia, this will be contradicted later. And we get to learn what kind of guys Daphne's into. Hint, it's a lot manlier than Niles. Once Frasier gets home, we get a really impressive Eddie trick, with him jumping over all the furniture and running to the door to greet Martin. Thanks to Gabriel Knights for getting me the link to an interview with Moose's trainer. Her name is Mathilde de Cagny, and I want to take a more in-depth look at her at some point, but we've got plenty of time to do that. For this episode, I am going to go into a little bit more background on Eddie. The original Eddie is played by a Jack Russell Terrier named Moose, and the story of how he came to get the role is pretty interesting. Moose was the youngest pup in his litter, and was born on Christmas Eve in 1990 in Florida. Despite being the youngest of the litter, he was not the runt. He was actually the biggest and most wily of all the puppies that were born that day. He lived with the Thisay family for 2.5 years, but he proved to be too much for them. He routinely chased cats, dug holes in their yard, and managed to climb trees when he'd escaped the house after chewing up their furniture. The Thisay family also never managed to get Moose house trained during his time with them. In early 1993, Moose was given to de Cagny for training. After staying with her for a mere 6 months, he was given the job on Frasier. Moose will continue to play Eddie until 2000, when his son Enzo will replace him. Moose spent the last 6.5 years of his life in retirement with DeCagney and her family. Interesting fact, during his career, to encourage Moose to lick or nuzzle his fellow actors, sardine oil or liver pate was applied to their skin. Once we get into the meat of this episode, we get several new locations. The first is the doctor's office in Niles' building, where Frasier takes Martin for a checkup. The nurse in this scene is played by Amy Alexandra Lloyd. She hasn't been in a whole lot of things. In fact, she only has 9 credits to her name from 1989 to 2002. Most relevant to Frasier, she's appeared in both an episode of Carolyn in the City and Kate and Allie. The only major role of note in Lloyd's acting career is a supporting spot in the 1996 film Loose Women, which had a Charlie Sheen cameo. Interestingly, the hypochondriac patient in the waiting room also only has 9 acting credits to her name. Her name is Marion Dugan. Dugan doesn't have any ties to Frasier-related shows like Lloyd did, but she played bit parts in 4 movies and 5 TV shows. The movies were Brain Donors, Jack the Bear, The Jim Carrey the Cable Guy, and Matilda. She passed in 2015 at the age of 97. Roz's only scene this episode is a short scene that involves her telling Frasier he's old and again talking about her wild love life. The talk about age and Daphne's lack of a love life got me wondering how old the various actors were. We already know Frasier is 41 at this time and is 3 years older than Kelsey Grammer is in real life. Assuming the characters are the same age as their actors, Niles would be 34 at this time, while both Roz and Daphne would be 32. Interestingly, Perry Gilpin and Jane Leavies are almost the exact same age. Gilpin is less than 2 months younger than Leavies. John Mahoney is only 53 at this time. We haven't been given a clear answer on his age yet, but it's certainly older than that, since I know he didn't have Frasier when he was 12. After the events of selling out, it seems like Frasier may have acquired a taste for nuts, as he's now seen eating them in this scene, while he's trying to decide who gets what out of his personal belongings. The item Frasier uses as an example is the African mask seen here. No one wants it, and Daphne says it freaks her out. Like the fertility doll Bulldog was messing with in the last episode, the African mask in question is from the Ghana region of Africa. It is known as a Dan mask. All Dan masks are carved from wood and stained with a brown dye. These masks are typically considered sacred artifacts and used to commune with the spirit world. During rituals, masked dancers would speak in the language of the spirit world instead of their native language. I'm not sure if it's a happy coincidence or Eberhard was just an African history fan, but the Dan mask being used in connection with the spirit world is a really nice tie to the themes of this episode. Niles talks wine again in this episode. Frasier suggests they toast to life with a bottle of Chateau Sauterne 75. This is about a $500 bottle of wine today. From what I can tell, plus or minus inflation, this was probably a $350 bottle of wine at the time of this episode's airing. Niles is quick to claim it as his own in the event of Frasier's death. The bottle Frasier brings back, at Niles' suggestion, is a Bedrolas Nouvelle. I probably just absolutely butchered the name on that. I apologize. I do not speak French, obviously. Which has an average price of $13 a bottle, with some going as low as a mere $4. The climax of this episode is in a room filled with extras at the wake for the late Dr. Newman. The wake is actually a Jewish Shiva, which is repeated multiple times in this episode, while it is pointed out repeatedly that Frasier isn't Jewish. The Shiva is a 7-day mourning period in Judaism. It typically begins right after the burial. It is for first-degree relatives, so parents, siblings, and spouses. During this time, the mourners will wear a torn garment for the entirety of the 7-day period, while friends and extended family visit those in mourning to offer condolences and comfort. We meet a few different actors when Frasier arrives at the Shiva. They are Cousin Alan, played by Murray Rubenstein. Rubenstein is a minor, that guy who was in that thing, actor, with 30 credits to his name. This is actually only the second credited role Rubenstein had, following an appearance on Law & Order in 1990. Rubenstein continued to appear regularly as a one-off guest star until 2006. Interestingly, in nearly half his appearances, he plays a doctor, the same profession as his late cousin in this role. Aunt Bobby is played by June Clawman, who has a similar credit list to Rubenstein, albeit more soap opera heavy, with appearances on Days of Our Lives and a 7-episode stint on The Bold and the Beautiful. Gail is the most famous of the mourners here, played by Maddie Corman. Prior to this episode, Corman appeared in 2 episodes of Kate and Allie, and starred in the 1987 comedy series Mr. President as the President's Wife. Since then, she's done a combination of movie and TV spots, including a role in Maid in Manhattan, Madam Secretary, and Law & Order SVU. The grieving widow is played by Stephanie Dunham. She's had a similar career to our other guest stars in this episode. Her most notable roles are a 10-episode stint on Dynasty, which is a show I wasn't familiar with, and it looks like, although it's not a daily soap opera, it is incredibly soapy. She also played the Queen of England in an episode of Preacher, which out of all the shows I've ever seen, sure is one of them. Lastly, she was a supporting cast member in the Chuck Norris film, Silent Rage. The nameless woman at the end of the episode, who gives Frasier her number, is played by Shawn Huff. She'll appear later in an episode of Christopher Lloyd's Modern Family. She takes on a starring role in the 6-episode drama McKenna, and perhaps most interestingly, she'll voice a character in the 2011 video game L.A. Noire. Our coda scene this week isn't the funniest, but it does earn a smile from me. Considering Daphne's supposed to be Martin's caretaker, I find it kind of funny the only chore we ever really see her doing is folding laundry. I realize this is all TV shorthand for her job here, but I thought it worth pointing out all the same. We also get a really good look at the Dan mask here, and I have to say, I agree with Daphne. It's a little creepy. This episode features 2 ties for each brother. Frasier's first tie is the maroon blue diamond tie he wore previously in episodes 6, 8, and 9. His second tie is the Thanksgiving tie. Thanks to the higher quality videos, we can see the pattern on the Thanksgiving tie is sort of a watercolor design. This gives us 4 appearances of both ties, and makes us the first episode of the series where Frasier doesn't wear a new tie. For Niles' ties, we have the return of the purple tie from episode 8, and the modern art tie from episode 6. So, no new ties for him either this episode. With that, we're still at 19 ties for Frasier and 15 for Niles. This also drops Niles down to an average of just 1 1/3 new ties per episode, the lowest of anyone thus far. I never seem to have any complaints about direction. Maybe it's just that I don't have a good enough eye for it, or maybe it's just that both Ackerman and Burroughs are masters at what they do, so there's nothing that doesn't look good. Either way, Ackerman's direction here is on point, and I have no complaints about it. Eberhard's script is still solid, but not as good as his prior one. Frasier's speech at the end of the episode about appreciating the little joys and surprises in life is a nice wrap-up to the topic at hand, and the ending works, but it all somehow feels a little hollow. I understand Frasier felt invested because of the similarities between himself and the late Doctor, but no one else in the family felt investment. I think this episode would have worked better if it was someone the entire family personally knew. Ironically, I assume Niles had met the Doctor before, given they worked in the same building, and given this assumption, I think he would have reacted pretty much the same way. Also, we only had 1 small Roz scene in this episode. Those complaints aside, Eberhard again dealt with a difficult topic with finesse. Moose showed why he was given the part of Eddie after only 6 months of training, and Niles cranked it up to Rebecca Howe levels of ridiculousness while claiming Frasier's belongings. If you're struggling to teach your kids about death, have a family meeting and settle in for this 6.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier.